Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. Just click donate. It helps keep this show going. Okay, on with the show.
About 2 hours northeast of Edmonton is the town of Elk Point. You wouldn't know it to look at it, but this small community of 1,300 people has a deep history dating back to the 1790s when both the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company established fur trading forts in the area. Now, located along the abundant North Saskatchewan River, it was an excellent place to connect with First Nations. And if you can make the trip, I highly recommend it. First, you will see this beautiful sculpture of an elk. It's a logical attraction given the name. And then you'll see a very large statue of a man holding surveying equipment and looking off towards the horizon. It was carved out by chainsaw. It stands at an impressive 9.8 meters, or about 3 stories high. About 200 years ago, this man happened to be in the area to map it and much of Alberta. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today I'm sharing the story of one of Canada's greatest surveyors and explorers. This is the tale of Peter Fidler. If you're a longtime listener, you know that many of our stories begin not in Canada, but in Britain. Now, Peter Fidler is no different. He was born on August 16, 1769 in Derbyshire, England, to James and Mary Fidler. Beside that, very little is known about his early life. Now, we do know that his father worked as a village constable while his brother, James Jr., was a road surveyor. And at some point, Fidler must have excelled in school because he caught the eye of one of the most important and prominent companies in the British Empire, the Hudson's Bay Company. At the time, the company recruited young men from England to be clerks and laborers. Most were poor, either looking for opportunities or adventure in North America. The company couldn't just accept anyone, though, so it chose those sturdy enough for the fur trade and smart enough to excel at logistics. Enter Peter Fidler. In April 1788, he was on board a ship on his way to a new life in the wilderness. Now, you'll remember that at the time it was known as Rupert's Land. In 1670, King Charles II gave Hudson Bay Company a monopoly over a 3.8 million square kilometer area, 1/3 of modern-day Canada. Rupert's Land essentially stretched from Labrador and Baffin Island to the Rocky Mountains. Now, if you're a longtime listener, you will know about Rupert's Land from my episodes about George Simpson and Thanadel Thur and Henry Kelsey, just to name a few. Now, Fidler had signed a 5-year contract as a laborer for the company, and it would be back-breaking work. Fidler would be expected to haul furs, supplies, firewood, and more. And that hard work would start the second he landed in Rupert's Land because there was really no other choice. As the wind howled on the cold shore of Hudson Bay, Fidler stared at his new home, a large wooden fort, when the next ship would not arrive at York Factory for another year. And you probably remember York Factory from many episodes of this podcast about David Thompson and George Simpson, as well as Thanadel Thur and many others. We don't know Fidler's thoughts at the time, but we do know he wasn't a laborer for long. He was described as exceptionally bright and motivated. His superiors at York Factory saw that he was too valuable to be a laborer. He was good with writing and numbers, and before long he was promoted to journal writing. Described as a sober, steady young man, he was considered qualified to be a, quote, good scholar and accountant, end quote. His new position took him further inland into North America for the first time, visiting Manchester House and then South Branch House. So he was a rising star in the Hudson's Bay Company, and they ensured he had the best mentor. In 1790, Fidler and another young employee by the name of David Thompson were sent to Cumberland House in present-day north-central Saskatchewan to begin training as surveyors. Their teacher was the first man ever hired to be a full-time surveyor by the Hudson's Bay Company, Philip Turner. At the time, Philip Turner was one of the most respected men in the Hudson's Bay Company. In his late 20s, he mapped out large sections of the northern Canadian prairies, and he followed in the footsteps of fur trading explorers like Henry Kelsey and Anthony Henday decades earlier. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company entrusted him with the tutelage of Thompson and Fidler. They wanted their best man to teach this new generation because they had high hopes for both individuals. The two were destined to become legends in the history of the fur trade, and in both life and death, Thompson overshadowed Fidler. But that wasn't always the case. At first, Fidler had the upper hand because of a near-tragic circumstance. On December 23, 1788, while out at Pine Island Fort along the North Saskatchewan River, Thompson fell down an embankment and seriously fractured his tibia, likely a compound fracture, which is when the bone pierces through the skin, causing a risk of infection. Now, it took hours for his fellow travelers to find him and carry him back to the fort. By then, his leg was severely swollen and not really healing properly. Such an injury really could be fatal or crippling at the time. It took 3 months for Thompson to even get out of bed, and 5 months before he was able to walk with the help of crutches. The injury was so severe he could not travel back to York Factory for transport to England. Instead, he had to spend the next 2 years recovering in Rupert's Land. Now, Thompson said it was the best thing that ever happened to him, and you can learn all about it in my episode about him from early 2024. Now, for Fidler, while Thompson healed, he was given the chance to travel with his mentor, Philip Turner, on a mission for the company. They would journey into the interior of the continent to see what the rival Northwest Company was up to in the Athabasca country. Along the way, they were tasked with looking for a direct river route from Hudson Bay to Lake Athabasca that would give the company a leg up on their competition. Athabasca country was home to the Cree, the Chippewan, and the Dene, and was a prime fur trading location. The cold winter months made for especially thick furs on beavers, and thus they were more valuable than elsewhere. Now, the problem was that the Northwest Company had gotten there first, and now the company was playing catch-up. As it turned out, Turner and Fidler were on a fool's errand. There was no direct river from Hudson Bay. Lake Athabasca is fed from the west by the Athabasca River and drains into the north along the Mackenzie River. The expedition, which lasted from 1790 to 1792, was a disappointment for the company, but it wasn't for Fidler. He spent those 2 years expanding his knowledge of surveying and map-making and wilderness survival. Now, Turner was so impressed with his young apprentice that he suggested Fidler should be the one to succeed him. And by the end of the expedition, Fidler seemed to be in the prime of his life with unlimited energy. Another member of the expedition, Malcolm Ross, said Fidler was very fit and would be up for the challenges of being in the wilderness. Now, Fidler showed this ability during the winter that he spent with the Chippewa near Great Slave Lake. Despite having little powder, provisions, or even a tent, he returned in the spring to Turner's camp in Athabasca, looking robust and healthy. During that time, Fidler became fluent in Chippewa, which really was beneficial in the future. And as soon as the expedition ended, Fidler set out on a new trip west in 1792. So it was clear to everybody that this was somebody special. He was told to go to the upper reaches of the North Saskatchewan River and extend the company's influence inland. Fidler left Buckingham House near present-day Lindbergh, Alberta, and mapped out the North Saskatchewan River, traveling west to the foothills. Along the way, he met with the First Nations that occupied the territory until he reached the edge of Kootenay land. Now, they occupied the southern interior of modern-day British Columbia, but often made journeys through the Rocky Mountains to trade with the Cree and the Blackfoot. Now, Fidler became not only the first European to meet the Kootenay people, but also the first to learn their language, and it gave him an incredible advantage over the Northwest Company rivals who were fast on his heels. Fidler wintered near the Rockies, then returned to York Factory in 1793, and once again, as soon as he arrived, he was sent back out by his superiors. This time, he would travel to the Seal River in search of a direct river route into Churchill. Churchill was an important trading post for the company along Hudson Bay, and the Seal River runs 250 kilometers in northern Manitoba, so there was this hope that there would be an easier way into the northern part of the continent. But you might remember Fort Churchill from my story on Thana Del Thurin. If you haven't yet, I suggest you listen to the episode about the woman they called the Ambassador of Peace from 2023. Fidler, however, was unlucky in his pursuit because there was no direct river route to Churchill via the Seal River, and so he returned to York Factory. Upon his return, he spent the next year settling into a routine, and in that time he married a Cree woman named Mary. Now, you'll remember these were known as country marriages, and they weren't considered legal because they involved no formality or documents. These marriages were often so a fur trader could marry an indigenous woman so she could help translate and foster exchanges. Now, in return, the woman would see her standing and security increase. And for the most part, both the fur traders and their employers saw women in these arrangements as completely disposable. But Peter and Mary Fidler's marriage would be an exception to the rule. Aside from a new marriage, Fidler spent several months working on maps. They were sent to the Hudson's Bay Company headquarters in London, England, and the board was very impressed with his work. It was suggested that Fidler return to the wilderness to map and establish forts. A letter was sent to York Factory, and Fidler was told to, quote, proceed inland on discoveries. Now, he loved being in the wilderness and found life in forts mundane. Upon receiving this letter, Fidler was sent back into the interior, and this time he went to Cumberland House, then onward to Carleton House near present-day Camp Sack, Saskatchewan. He traded with the First Nations, conducted surveys, and then prepared for his return east. In the spring of 1797, as soon as the snow melted and the ice on the river broke, he set out for York Factory with 19 canoes and 2 boats full of furs. He received a hero's welcome, but Fidler only had enough time to rest briefly before he once again returned to Cumberland House, and there he remained for 2 years. And that's when the London bosses instructed him to go deeper into Athabasca country. Now, because the competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company was heating up, they needed their best man on the front lines. In 1799, the rivalry was intensifying. On August 5th, Fidler left Cumberland House for a journey south along the Beaver River to present-day Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. There, he built Bolsover House and then wintered at Lac La Biche. Now, during that time, Northwest Company traders continually interfered with the post by running interference with the First Nations before they could ever reach Fidler's fort. So for the next 2 years, Fidler tried to outcompete the Northwest Company and establish Chesterfield House along the South Saskatchewan River. In the summer of 1802, Fidler made a brief stop in York Factory to get supplies and new orders before he ventured out into the Lake Athabasca in September. This time, he was joined by 17 men to help establish more trading posts in the Athabasca and Peace River region of present-day northern Alberta. Prior to leaving, he sent maps and papers to London, which helped fill in more of those blanks in the interior of the continent. Meanwhile, Fidler and his men built Nottingham House on English Island within Lake Athabasca, and from there, Fidler could actually see the Northwest Company fort of Fort Chipewyan only 1 kilometer away. The Hudson's Bay Company had arrived far too late. Fort Chipewyan had been around since about the 1790s and was considered the Athens of the Arctic. While Fidler and his men struggled in their tiny fort, their rivals enjoyed a comparatively luxurious existence complete with a library of 2,000 books. And for the next 4 years, Fidler conducted missions with the local Chipewyan and Cree under almost constant harassment from the competitions. Their tactics were terribly petty and at times downright dangerous. They wrecked one of Fidler's canoes, they tore up his garden, they scared away game, and even went so far as to almost burn down the entire fort. Fidler wrote, "I suppose it was their intention to starve our people out." Now, Fidler finally reached an agreement with the Northwest Company to provide him with 500 beaver pelts and provisions if Fidler promised to leave the Athabasca region for 2 years. But neither side actually honored the agreement, and it quickly fell apart. For the First Nations of the region, though, it was a perfect scenario. They used the rivalry to get the maximum profit from the furs they collected by playing the two companies off each other. By 1806, Fidler had had enough. They left, and that fort that had been home for 4 years slowly decayed and disappeared. And I should note that Fort Chipewyan continues to exist to this day as a community of 800 people. After his departure, Fidler was back in York Factory, despondent over his failure at Lake Athabasca. But he licked his wounds and then accepted the position of postmaster at Cumberland House. And this was exactly what Fidler needed. While the Northwest Company men harassed him at Lake Athabasca, at Cumberland House, members of the rival company were nothing but friendly. He would often have dinners with them. Fidler was approaching his 40s, but he wasn't slowing down. He still took short journeys and mapped much of Lake Winnipeg and the Red River area in 1808. Those maps were then sent to London, where he continued to be very appreciated. Now, after years of dedicated service, the company honored him with a promotion to full surveyor. It came with a raise, and his pay was now £100. They also told him he would become a chief trader someday, which would give him a share of the company. But all this came with a new assignment. He was to go to Ile-la-Crosse in present-day northwestern Saskatchewan. So So in June 1810, Fidler did as he was told, but once again he was in the crosshairs of the Northwest Company. He only lasted a year before he asked for a year off to recuperate in England, which he had actually not seen in decades. And by August 1812, Fidler was back at York Factory with a brand new assignment. And this time, he would be at the center of one of the most influential conflicts in Canadian history. Before we continue with Peter Fidler's story, let me take a quick moment to talk about Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk. He inherited his title following his father's passing in 1799, and by then he had witnessed Scottish farmers being displaced by the Highland clearances. From 1750 to 1860, a significant number of tenants in the Scottish Highlands and Islands were completely evicted. Now, Selkirk had read about Alexander Mackenzie's voyages in modern-day Manitoba through the Red River Valley, and he was completely inspired. He contacted the Hudson's Bay Company in 1802 and asked them if he could set up a Scottish colony in the Red River area. They refused, as they felt it would disrupt the trade, and as I mentioned, competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company had been intensifying and at times was becoming violent. This conflict inspired the company to finally grant Selkirk 300,000 square kilometers of land in the Red River area in 1811. They hoped the Scottish settlers would help them assert their claim over the vital territory. It also helped that Selkirk had really spent the past decade buying up shares in the Hudson's Bay Company and was now the controlling shareholder, so it wasn't that he was granted access, he was essentially calling the shots, and now he had control of an area 5 times the size of Scotland. Selkirk agreed to provide 200 men to work for the company and promised his colony would stay out of the fur trade. I do have to point out, though, that the land given to Selkirk was in the Cree and Anishinaabe territory, and neither nation was consulted on this land transfer. 60 years later, those First Nations were starved by dwindling bison herds, and it was only then that the land was officially ceded to the Crown in 1871 when Treaty 1 was signed. Selkirk settlers began to arrive in 1812, and the Hudson's Bay Company sent their best man, Peter Fidler, to the region. Now, if he thought the Northwest Company was a pain in his backside before, he had no idea what he was getting into. The Northwest Company hated what became the Red River Colony. They were a direct threat to canoe and transportation routes into Western Canada. The area was also a source of pemmican, a calorie-rich food made from berries, fat, and dried meat, harvested from the immense bison herds that migrated through the Red River Valley. Pemmican could last for upwards of a year and was perfect for fur traders far from civilization. Now, no fur trading enterprise could actually survive without it, so the Northwest Company men did everything they could to impede the progress of the colonists. In the autumn of 1812, Fidler was the postmaster of Brandon House, and one of his duties was to escort colonists to the new settlement. He wintered with them and started surveying property lots along the Red River when things got violent and complicated. In 1814, Governor Miles Macdonald, who was appointed by Lord Selkirk, issued the Pemmican Proclamation to stop the Métis from exporting pemmican out of the Red River area. The decision would cripple the fur trade. The Hudson's Bay Company, though, was granted an exception thanks to Lord Selkirk, but the Northwest Company was left without one of their most important resources. Thus began the Pemmican War, which I will cover in detail in September 2025. For the purpose of this story, you should know that from 1814 to 1821, the two companies battled. And I mean that literally. On June 19, 1816, the Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company fought the Battle of Seven Oaks near modern-day Winnipeg, where 22 men died. The war ended when the Northwest Company merged with the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. Fidler was thrust into the middle of this conflict. In June 1815, Governor Miles Macdonald resigned, and Fidler became in charge of the Red River Colony, but just on a temporary basis. Métis leader Cuthbert Grant was leading raids against the colonists, so Fidler ordered all settlers to leave the Red River area, and in July 1815, they abandoned the settlement for Jack River House. This, though, was short-lived. Colin Robertson, a fur trader with the Hudson's Bay Company, immediately returned to re-establish the colony. Now, in the meantime, Fidler went to York Factory to meet with Robert Semple, who would replace him as governor and to escort the new settlers to the Red River area. Fidler then went to Brandon House to work on the logistics to ensure the colony's survival amid the two warring companies. As for Semple, he really didn't last long as governor of the Selkirk colony. About a year after he arrived, he was killed at the aforementioned Battle of Seven Oaks. In September 1817, though, Fidler had enough. He was almost 50, and he just wanted out of the Red River Colony and this whole Pemmican War chaos. So the company made him chief trader of Brandon House and Dauphin Lake House until mid-1821. But by then his health was beginning to fail, so the company offered him a pension. Now working for the company was all Fidler ever knew, and despite his age and health, all he ever wanted to do was work. Fidler believed that if he wasn't a fur trader, he was nothing. He just simply couldn't foresee retirement in some Montreal home. A week after he was told he had to retire, he took his wife Mary and some of their children to be baptized. Mary and their children had never left Fidler's side. Their relationship was so much more than a country marriage. Fidler deeply loved his wife and family, and he had no intention of abandoning them or leaving them destitute. So wanting to ensure Mary was taken care of, he formally married her and legitimized the union. He also prepared his will for his family. And then, the Hudson's Bay Company ordered Fidler to go to Dauphin Lake House. Not as a chief trader as he was before, or even a fur trader, but as a lowly clerk. The man who had given decades of his life for the company was now back at square one, essentially through no fault of his own. He'd literally helped the Hudson's Bay Company establish fur trading posts throughout the Canadian West, and now he was to be a lowly clerk. Crushed, his will to live left him. At Dauphin Lake House, he was listed as a servant, and his health continued to decline, and he never recovered. On December 17, 1822, only 5 months after his 14th child Harriet was born, Peter Fidler died at the age of 53. He was buried in a simple coffin in the woods outside Fort Dauphin. And while the company he gave his life to betrayed him, time gave Peter Fidler his dues. Today, Fidler Point on Lake Athabasca is named for him, same with Peter Fidler Park in Empress, Alberta. A monument to his legacy was erected at Fort Dauphin, and of course there is that large carved statue at Elk Point, Alberta. But there is one more part to this story, and it happened a century and a half later in the swingin' 60s. After his death in 1822, Fidler bequeathed the bulk of his estate to a fund that would accumulate interest until August 16, 1969. No one was to touch it until the 200th anniversary of his birth, and on that day, the money was to go to the male heir of his son, Peter. The fortune sat through the creation of Canada and 2 world wars, and by the time humans had landed on the moon, the descendants of Peter Fidler sat in anticipation with dollar signs in their eyes. But none of them knew that the fortune was long gone. In fact, it didn't even last 10 years. Once Mary died in 1826, their living children pressured to have access to the fund. The executors of the will, who were all officials with the Hudson's Bay Company, agreed to release the money to Thomas, the eldest son, to split among his siblings. And rather than providing millions of dollars to his descendants in 1969, the 11 children of Peter Fidler were given £1,900 soon after their mother's death. The fortune had only grown by £400 since Fidler's death. And when August 16, 1969 came along, 251 claimants hoped for a bit of the fortune. But what they got was nothing. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at Peter Fidler. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.